So what I want to do today is I want to finish up with the layout. So some ways that you can deal with the layout of XHTML forms. And then we're going to talk about how PHP manages forms. And that is commonly called session management. So really what today's lecture is about is session management. And I haven't said what this X is in the XHTML. Normally you probably hear HTML forms. The only difference is that XHTML imposes certain syntactic requirements on an HTML form. For example, it requires that all begin tags have an end tag. So in normal HTML, you might see something like that, which is a paragraph tag. XHTML says that must be matched. So you might actually see something like that, or you might see P like that. So XHTML requires that all tags be matched. There's some other requirements for XHTML. They're not really important for this course. Yes?
So does that also mean that in places where you can get away with just putting an end tag after a beginning tag?
Yes. Well, but this is considered, that's considered a begin and end tag. So that's considered acceptable. Okay? But just having the open tag, like begin tag, like you see in a lot of HTML documents, you can't do that in XHTML. So it just has a few extra requirements that aren't important for this course. If I had more time, I'd go into them, but I do not. See, that's not what I want. Shoot, now I can't get rid of this pen selection. That's annoying. Don't want you. Okay, well, can't get rid of it, so I won't worry about it. Okay, so layout of HTML forms. Let's first get there. So there's a number of ways you can organize your form content, and some of these are considered a little bit outdated, but you still see them, and especially as programmers, we're not really graphic design specialists. We may not have a lot of knowledge of CSS, which is cascading style sheets, and is generally the accepted way that you go about formatting HTML pages, but it may not be something that's in your wheelhouse. So these are some tips you can use for organizing content in forms to set them apart. So one thing you can do is use what's called a field set. And a field set is going to put a rectangular box around a set of widgets, which can be useful for organizing the widgets into certain categories. And you can actually put a title or legend at the top of that field set. So it starts with the field set tag, and then if you want to include a legend, you have the legend tag, and there's a couple attributes like a line that allows you to control where that legend appears, and then you put the widgets into the form, into that part of the form. So field set was introduced before they had CSS. There's ways to do that same thing using CSS, but if you're not a big CSS pro, like for homework 8, where we ask you to lay out forms, using field sets is a fine way to organize your widgets. Then another thing you should know about is that many widgets aren't automatically labeled for you. A couple exceptions are menu items, the option tag automatically labels a menu item, and buttons, the value field automatically labels a button. But radio buttons, check buttons, text boxes, they're all unlabeled. The value fields don't control what appears next to them. So typically, you need a label next to your many of your widgets. And there is an explicit way that you can specify that a label is associated with a widget. And the way you do that is you start that label with the label tag, and then you use the for attribute to specify which widget it's supposed to be associated with. So here it says for equals username, and you can see over here there is ID equals uname. So the for field must match the ID attribute. So the for attribute or for value must match the ID, not the name. And as we'll see later, the ID attribute is a way of uniquely identifying a HTML element so that it can be accessed by a JavaScript program. So when you say that a label is associated with a widget, first of all, they need to be in physical proximity. HTML or the browser won't automatically put the two of them together if they're not physically co-located. But for people who are visually challenged, there are readers that will actually read through a web page for them. And by using labels and associating them with widgets, that allows the reader to know that, to give it a useful name. Because all you have is a radio button, the reader can't really give it a meaningful name. So having explicitly tagged something like username as a label, now a reader will be able to tell someone who is visually challenged that this is the label being used for, in this case, this text field. So this is not, I guess, so much a layout issue as it is a way of making your web interface more accessible to people who may be visually challenged. Okay, and then there's tab order. And oftentimes you can tab through a particular web form. So here we have a web form that allows you to enter the username, the password, your favorite programming language, and your favorite computer scientist. Let's actually quickly get this into a HTML form so I can show you what happens. Get most of it into an HTML form, and then I'll have to deal with the rest. So we'll make this foo temp foo.html. Looks like I called it foo.j. So we'll finish this off. Tab index equals 4. And actually go and write this as foo.html. Okay, so if I show this in a browser, if I start tabbing, you see that the username highlighted. Then I tab again, and it goes to password. Tab again, goes to favorite programming language. Tab again, favorite computer scientist. Tab again, it actually goes up to it's actually up here right now in the URL. If I tab again, it selects the entire URL, and you can see it's just now tabbing around up here. So, tab order is often important because a lot of users will tab around in a form. And if you see what I've done here, let me make this bigger. I have used something called tab index to indicate in what order the tabs should occur. So associate it with the form. Yeah, what's happening? I have for some reason let's go look at it this way. Okay, so I am specifying tab indexes here. And I'm specifying the order in which the tab should visit each form. Generally, you start at 1. For some reason, 0 doesn't seem to work with most browsers. And you typically just put them in the order that you want those tabs to appear. If I take it out, you're going to see that the tab order is different. So I take them out. And let's do it again. So now if I start tabbing, you'll see it goes across the page, which is probably not what I want, because usually you want to enter your username and password before you enter any other information. So if in the absence of tab index, it does it literally on the order in which they appear in the page. So in this case, the username appeared first. Then the next thing that appeared was the favorite language. The third thing that appeared was the password. And the fourth thing that appeared was the favorite computer scientist. And so that was the order that the tab index does. So by default, the tab index, by default, the tab order follows the physical position or physical order of widgets in a file. So you sometimes want to change that. You do it with the tab index attribute. Now, this example shows you something else, which is the use of tables to lay out form widgets. So tables are a very powerful way to organize widgets because you often want to lay out widget groups side by side. So you'd like a widget group, maybe this would be one widget group, this might be another widget group, then maybe you want a third widget group centered under those two. And you can't do that by just putting widgets one after another in the file. They'll just all get laid out in a vertical stream, and that's one way to do it, but it's not particularly attractive. You can use cascading style sheets to achieve this kind of layout right here, but unless you're a CSS expert, it's kind of difficult to do. And it turns out that CSS introduced table-like elements because people so often use tables. I often just find it easier to use a table itself to lay out the elements. And you can see you start a table with the table tag, then TR stands for table row. And I don't know why they called it TD, but TD is actually a column within the row or a cell. So in this case, we're saying the first row right here consists of 4 elements: the username, this input widget, this favorite programming language tag, and this favorite language widget. And then similarly, this row, the second row, consists of the password label, the password text box, so on and so forth. So there's three basic tags: the table tag, a row tag distinguishing where a row starts and ends, and a column tag, which is TD. And using that, you can get nice layouts like this, and it lays the cells out aligned. So you can see username and password are in one column, then the two text boxes are laid out nicely in second column, then these next labels are laid out in column 3. Without the table, everything would appear with no spaces. So this text box right here would be jammed up against favorite computer scientists. It would look something like that, which wouldn't be as attractive. So tables also line things up in columns. And there are ways to specify that columns span multiple, or that yes, that a column is actually more than one column wide. You can specify its span as 2 columns or 3 columns wide. Similarly, with a row, you can actually say a row is equal to 2 rows or 3 rows, and so you get more space for it that way. So here, this one, you would actually say, to get this one, you would say that it spans 2 columns. And I'm not going to show you that. You can look that up. There's just by Googling it, you can figure out what are the attributes to specify that a column spans multiple columns. So tables are a nice way to lay out your form elements. Okay, so tables are a nice way to lay out form elements. And the tags you care about are table, row, column. So this is a row, this is a column. And then you can use attributes to specify certain information like spanning of how many columns a column spans or how many rows a row spans. Okay, so questions about laying out your HTML forms. On homework 8, you're going to do an HTML form, and I'd like you to make at least a bit of an effort to organize it in a pleasing way. So you have an opportunity to be creative. There's no requirements about how to lay it out, but if you just lay it out vertically, I'm going to tell the TA that they should deduct a few points for it not looking particularly good. You should try to make an effort to make it look good using field sets or using tables and the like. Okay. So let's now move on to session management. And session management is really about maintaining state information. Okay, as I said last time, web programming is different than what you have encountered in the past. And there were 2 differences that I pointed out last time. One is the fact that with web programming, state info is not maintained between scripts. So when one script finishes, its state information is lost. And the second issue is that input typically comes from a form, not from a file. And the third big difference is output is typically in the form of a web page. Rather than being written to a file or to standard out. So the big issue is that when you are getting state information, or you're doing some processing, you get some form information, and you're going to have to maintain it. Like, for example, if you're taking someone through a multi-step checkout process for Amazon, the first page may ask for address information. The second page might ask for credit card information. The third page could ask for maybe shipping address information. Well, you have to maintain state information as they're going through this checkout process. So there has to be a way to keep that information even though the scripts can't do it themselves. Then, how do you get your input from a form? That's the first thing we're going to talk about today, is how you get it from a form. We've already talked about how you do output. That was kind of in the introduction to PHP, the fact that the page can actually be an HTML page with embedded code islands, and that anything you print out is going to appear as is going to be sent back to a browser. And so you have to output typically HTML tags in order to format your output. So we've already covered 3. Today we're going to cover 1 and 2. So the way that, just as a quick review, whoops, not there, not here either, so let's bring up the quick review. So on the browser side, you have a form. It has a way of sending the form information to the server, and it has a way of invoking a script on the server side when a submit button is sent. And the information it sends is going to be determined by the name and value attributes for the widgets. So the name will appear as so basically when it comes in on the server side, it generally occurs as a hash table, whether it's Perl or Python or PHP. On the server side, your form information is going to come in the form of a dictionary. And the keys are going to be the names in the name attribute, and the values are going to be from or derived from the value attribute. So there is something called CGI, which stands for Common Gateway Interface. And it basically is a protocol for packaging form data and sending it to the server. And each language typically has CGI modules that package then that form data into dictionaries. So you don't really have to worry about it. It's just when you hear the word CGI, that's what people are talking about. They're talking about this protocol that packages form data and gets it sent across the internet to the server, and then the unpacking process that occurs to get that form data unpacked and into dictionaries that you can use on the server side. We're not concerned about that here. That's something that IT specialists can worry about. We'll let them worry about that. Okay. The other thing that you need to be careful about that I mentioned the other time, but I'll mention it again, is that if you allow multiple selections for checkboxes or menus, then for PHP, you need to make sure that the name ends with a pair of square brackets. And the reason is that if you don't do it, then the CGI interface for PHP will send only the last item selected. So if omitted, PHP only forwards the last selection, or bottommost, actually, is the way it's generally referred to, the bottommost selection to the script, which isn't what you want. Now, that's not the case in Perl or Python. You leave those square brackets off for Perl or Python, they still comes in as an array with all the selections, but not so in PHP. So it's generally just safest to put those square brackets in there when you have any widget that allows multiple selections. Okay, so that's the form side. So the users entered their form information, they've hit submit, the script on the back end is invoked. How do we get access to these key value pairs that I've been talking about? The answer is that in PHP, the way you get the form data is with one of three arrays: $_get, $_post, $_request. As you might guess from the names of the first two, if the method for sending form information is get, you'll get your key value pairs from the get array. If the method for posting is post, you'll get the key value pairs from post. Request combines, so combines get and post. So in that case, you don't have to worry about which posting method was used. It will have, in effect, the union of the two, which I found to be convenient when I was doing Code Assessor, because at some point I needed to change from get to post. My strings that I was sending to Code Assessor got to be too long, and I had to change a whole bunch of array references because I'd always been using get. With request, you never have to worry about how the data is being sent. So you're free to use request if you want in your homework assignment. So again, the names that you assign your widgets will be the keys, and that's how you access information. Sometimes if you haven't selected something like a radio button, then there will be no data in the form arrays for that particular widget. In other cases, like for text, if you don't provide a value, you get an empty string. So you just have to know for each widget whether the failure on the user's part to provide information, whether that means there's no entry or whether there is an entry for that form element. But that's generally not a big deal. If you're smart, you will give default values for your radio button groups, for your checkboxes, for your menus, and that way you'll always be assured of getting some value on the back end. Okay. So you get that information. That's pretty easy. There's not a lot of difficulty with it, but there's two big things. Never trust the data that you receive. So you must validate. Actually, there's two steps. First, you sanitize, then you verify. Okay, and we talked about this last time. Does anyone remember why you don't trust the data you receive? Let's say you form checked it on the client side. Why do I have to check it again on the PHP side? Why isn't this a waste of time? Okay, because of hackers, but how can hackers specifically?
They can insert form data.
Okay, so they can insert form data. So for example, if you have get allows a person to bypass your web interface. It may not even be a hacker. It may be someone who just is bookmarking. Once you can use get to bookmark web pages. Okay, the URL will be kept with all the form data. Well, maybe they just accidentally entered some invalid form data. So it could be a genuine mistake, or it could be a hacker trying to circumvent your web interface. But web interfaces can be circumvented. Even if you use POST rather than GET, hackers that know their stuff can circumvent your web interface. So you need to verify the data that you receive. And you have to, before you verify, you need to sanitize, because there are some issues that come up, that some that are benign, where someone's not trying to attack you, but if you're not careful, you could still end up in trouble. And then other situations called cross-site scripting attacks, where someone is actually trying to spoof you and lead people to sites that they wouldn't normally access. So here's two examples. Let's say that I am getting a program. So let's see if I can, I'm going to use Emacs again because I like using it. So in Code Assessor, this issue came up. You often have include statements, include, # include, standard io.h, # include, standard lib, let's say cmath. Okay? So let's just say I had these two include statements. And if they come into a browser and I try to display this stuff, so let's say that I call this code.html, and now I try to display it. Whoops. What happened? It thinks they're tags. So it thinks that it thinks string lib is a tag, and it thinks math is a tag, because anything between angled brackets is a tag in HTML. So I ran into this problem very quickly when I was doing Code Assessor. Stuff would come into the browser, I could verify it, it worked, this was fine, but when I sent it back, it was stripping the tags. Well, you can fix that. There are what are called entity codes, so I can instead say anything that starts with an ampersand is the start of what's called an HTML entity code. You can get all kinds of symbols if you use entity codes. So LT stands for less than. The semicolon indicates the end. So the semicolon, this starts it. This is delimiter ending the code. Because often, like in this case, I don't want any spaces between the code and the next character. So similarly, I can say this is greater than, this is again less than, this is again greater than. And now if I reload, okay, at least it comes up, but there's still the issue of you actually need after each of them a line break. Okay, so I don't want to send the code like that though. I want to send the code, I want to send it like this because that's what the code really looks like. But on the back end, I'm going to have to do some stuff in order to make sure that when I send it back, it's not all messed up. Okay, so that's one case. Here's another case. I have string foo equals, or name equals Brad Vanderzanden. Okay, and on the back end, I am going to try to insert into a database. Well, if you remember, inserting something into a database, insert into, say, X, perhaps, values. And the thing is that the query has to be as passed as a string. Well, the problem is you have your code here. I know this isn't completely accurate, but you have your code. Well, the problem is, what's the problem? Anyone see a problem when $ code gets interpolated into that string? There's quotes in my string. This quote right here is going to terminate, is going to match this quote. That's not good, because it's going to presumably cause the PHP interpreter to emit an error. Okay, and it did when I was first designing Code Assessor. It was getting stuck where halfway through code it would encounter a quote and it would think the string ended there, and then the rest of this, well, that's not a valid PHP command, and PHP would come up with a syntax error. Well, that was benign. A hacker could do better. A hacker could start with after Brad Vanderzanden, it could be like encrypt hard drive, send ransom note. Okay, obviously not quite in that, but with nice little PHP commands that encrypt everything and then do bad things. So that's where sanitizing comes into play. Okay, so that's the second example. Third example is what's called a cross-site scripting attack. And I will show that. Oops. That doesn't look. Is this it? Yes, this is it. Okay, here's an example of a cross-site scripting attack. You have a blog or something, a discussion board. People are able to post comments. Well, most of the time the comments are pretty innocuous, but let's say that a hacker uploads this particular comment. Okay. You may not know what this is, but A stands for an anchor or link. So this is the start of a link. href equals hashtag is simply the saying that this is the current page location. Whatever the current page location is actually what the pound sign is replaced with, the current URL. This onClick says that when you click on this link, that the href attribute will be reset. So the document, we'll get to this when we talk about JavaScript, but you can modify the elements of a HTML page by modifying attributes in what's called the document object model, or DOM. So we will get to that when we get to JavaScript, but for the time being, all you need to know is that you can, using this particular path, modify the link that we are going to jump to. So initially it's saying if they click on this, jump to the current page. It's a no-op. But now they're saying that when you click, they're changing the location you're going to be taken to www.downloadvirus.com. Probably not what you were hoping for, unless you were an anti-hacker. And then this is what is going to appear as the label for the link, which looks pretty innocuous. Sort post by date, something that you might well want to do as a user. So you could well be suckered into clicking on this particular link and bad things happen. So you don't want a hacker to be able to give you this type of string and just blindly echo it back to users, because if you just blindly echo the string back, then you've allowed the hacker to execute what is called a cross-site hacking attack. This is a cross-site hacking attack. Okay, they have essentially spoofed the user into selecting or going to a website that they would not normally go to. So I've given you 3 examples where it's important to sanitize your string. One, where I am sending C++ code with angled brackets, and those will be mistaken as tags if I don't do something about it. The second example, again, I'm sending code that has quotes in it, and if I try to insert that code into a database, then the quotes are going to prematurely terminate the query, and at best, it's going to cause a PHP syntax error. At worst, a clever hacker is going to follow up with some new PHP commands that are going to do marvelous things to your backend. And the third example was the cross-site scripting attack, where a user is spoofed into clicking on a fake link that takes them to a dangerous website. So for all these reasons, before you even try to verify, you first sanitize. PHP has a number of sanitization functions. Okay, and they're listed here as useful string functions. So add slashes takes care of that second problem I was talking about. Add slashes will put backslashes in front of single quotes, double quotes, and backslashes. And that way, when you call your insert query on the database, the backslash on the quotes is going to say, this isn't really a quote that terminates the string. This is a quote that was meant to be part of the string that I'm inserting into the database. So add slashes allows you to defang double quotes, single quotes, and backslashes so that they don't cause problems for you. Okay? And you don't want to send the string back with the backslashes, so before you would send it back to the user, this is what I have to call when I send stuff back from Code Assessor, I call strip slashes. Strip slashes and add slashes are inverses. So add slashes and strip slashes are inverses. They invert each other. So I call add slashes before I insert code into the Code Assessor database. I call strip slashes before I send the string back to your browser. Nick, you're looking confused about that.
Well, if you strip the slashes before you send it back to the browser, wouldn't the browser then chop all that and think it's a tag again?
We're not talking about tags, we're talking about quotes. So now I'm worried about what happens with quotes.
Okay.
Yep. So this is different. So this is stopping the database from getting. Okay, now we're going to move on to the tags. Okay, so there is a HTML entities that will replace all special HTML codes like the angle brackets with their HTML entities instead. So if something comes in as, for example, H1, it will be replaced with ampersand LT, H1, ampersand GT. So HTML entities replaces all kind of reserved HTML symbols with their entity codes. Okay, and HTML entity decode does the opposite. It replaces the entity codes with their text equivalent. So it would take a ampersand LT semicolon and replace it with a less than sign. It would take the ampersand GT semicolon and replace it with a greater than sign. So what happens in Code Assessor is that when I send a string to the browser and it's going to be #include, say, IOString, then what I actually have to do is I call HTML entities so that this gets replaced with ampersand less than and this gets replaced with ampersand greater than. So I call HTML entities on the string before I send it to the browser, and what gets sent to the browser is this, whoops, not this string, is the string with the entity codes. And so it shows up properly. When it comes to the browser, it looks like this. Well, I haven't told you yet how I get the BRs in there, but it shows up with the entity codes and it gets properly displayed. Now, when it comes back, that's no good. I can't give this particular code to the C++ compiler. It will choke on it. That's not valid. So then, before I give it to the C++ compiler, I call entity HTML entity decode. That restores it, restores all of the less than and greater than characters, and it becomes all good for the compiler. Okay? And then to get the new lines in there, I use NL to BR, which stands for new line to BR. Every new line character, so what this does is it takes every new line character and replaces it with a BR tag, which is what gives me the BRs at the end here, these BRs right there. So NL to BR is helpful for converting in code, converting new lines to BR tags. And I have a few others that are listed here, but these are the big ones. HTML special characters will actually replace not just HTML tag characters, but also single quotes, double quotes, and backslashes with their entity codes. So it won't actually put backslashes in front of your double quotes. It will actually also replace them with their entity code. So that's another way to handle double quotes, single quotes, and backslashes, is with HTML special chars. Okay, so this replaces quotes, it replaces tags and quotes. Quotes with entity codes. Okay, but it says this function only does a subset of the replacement that HTML entities does. That's interesting. Let me just check something. I thought it did. I'll have to check this statement. I'll check it. I actually thought it did a superset of the replacements, but this is saying subset.
So are these doing the replacements in place, or
No.
are they doing that?
They're doing this is not, none of these are in place. These are all making copies and returning copies. But generally, what the thing is $string equals, because almost always you want the string replaced with the sanitized version. Okay. And the way that this knocks off cross-site scripting attacks is when you get a string like this, what do you call on it, do you think, to knock out a cross-site scripting attack? What would you call on your strings to knock out this cross-site scripting attack? HTML entities, because that will replace all of those tags with their entity codes, and it will become obvious actually to a user when it gets displayed what someone was trying to do to them, because once this string is replaced with its HTML entity codes and this string is displayed, it will literally display like this now. Literally like that. It will no longer be a link. It will literally show up like that to all users, and they will see it for what it was, which was an attempt at a cross-site scripting attack. Okay. So in the actual, whereas if you didn't do it, what would show up is just sort posts by date, and it would be in blue where you would be tempted to click on it. So that sanitizes it. Once you've sanitized it, you can verify. So verification involves typically using regular expressions. So preg match. Something that I just discovered in the last few days, and I haven't had time to put into my notes, so I won't test you on it, is that there are filters that PHP has. So there are, if I go to W3 Homes, let's go to PHP, there we go. There's a PHP filter input, which actually has filters for different types. Like you can check to see if an email address is valid. So the command is filter input, and you give it a string, and then the type of filter you want to apply to the string, and returns true or false depending on whether it's valid, whether it passes the filter. Now, I'm not going to test you on this because I just discovered this myself, so I'm looking into it. It's not in the notes. I just wanted you to be aware that PHP does already have predefined filters that you can use, and you can go to W3 Homes. They have a list of the filters that can be applied. So there's ones that check URLs, there's ones that check, I think, dates, ones that check integers, floats, a lot of different things. Okay, so that way you don't have to build up your own regular expression every time for certain things. Yes?
Are we allowed to use these filters in the homework or anything? Or?
I'd rather actually you use regular expressions just to get practice with regular expressions. Out in the real world, knock yourself out. But right now, you've only been introduced to regular expressions, and so I'd like you to use regular expressions, especially because the final exam is going to have regular expressions on it. Okay. So now you've got your data, you've verified it. Provided there's no errors, you now want to perhaps output something to the client, and you're going to want to potentially save this information even after this script has terminated. So in order to do that, so now we're going to actual session management and saving. So actually this is now saving state info. There are two client-side solutions and there are two server-side solutions. The client-side solutions are cookies and hidden form elements. And the server-side solutions are PHP sessions and databases. So saving the information in a database. They all have advantages and disadvantages, and I'm about to go through them. So the basic problem is the script ends after it executes, and you've served the page back to the client. So the client now has the outputted information, but maybe you want to save the billing address. Okay? So there's 4 ways you could do it. You could send the billing address back to the client in the form of cookies, in the form of hidden form elements. You could save that billing address in a PHP session variable, or you could save that billing address in a database. Okay. So let's look at the various things you can do. So cookies you've probably heard of, and they've got a bad reputation because generally they've been associated with people snooping on you. And so a lot of people disable them. But they do have a number of advantages associated with them. Oops. See if I can find those advantages. Yeah, here they just have the advantage. Okay, so I'm going to have to tell you what the advantages and the disadvantages are. So for cookies, the advantages are that they persist across sessions. Well, they persist, and by this they persist across, the user can close the browser and then reopen. So user could close browser, close and reopen browser, and they're still available. So for example, it seems like some newspapers will have a cookie on your browser that indicates how many articles you've read. You might get 5 free articles a month, and after that they want you to subscribe. So they'll put a cookie on your browser that indicates how many articles you've read thus far that month. And so they want it to persist even after you've closed the browser. So they persist across sessions, and they can be used by both the client and the server. So the client can get access to them through JavaScript. Okay, so sometimes the client, maybe the New York Times on the back end, it wants access to that number of articles read. When it sees that it's gotten to the limit, it's going to print an advertisement saying you have to subscribe if you want to read more. And the third advantage, they can be used with multiple servers. So what that means is that in big corporations like Amazon, it's not always, a server is not going to be dedicated to your session. When you give the billing information, one server may handle the billing information, send the page back to the browser, and when the browser sends the credit card information back, a different server may handle it. So in this case, one server can write information like the billing address into your cookies, and then another server can later read that information out. Okay, but they're not frequently used anymore. Well, yes, they're not all that frequently used. The big disadvantage is hackers can change them, can manipulate them. Another big advantage, users often turn them off or often disable them. And they consume bandwidth. Because what happens with cookies is that they're actually sent back to the browser on every page. Every time form data is sent to the user or to the back end, the cookies are sent as well, because all cookie, not all, but because all cookies associated with this domain For example, UTK is a domain, Amazon is a domain, are sent to the server with the form data. So if you have a lot of cookies, you end up with a lot of bandwidth being consumed. So those are the advantages and the disadvantages of cookies. If you want to use cookies, in PHP the command is set cookie. And you give this is the first parameter is the key, the second parameter is the value, and the third is the duration, how long the cookie lasts before it's removed on the browser end. So for example, every month, the newspaper may want the cookie removed or refreshed. And cookies have to be sent in what is called the header information for a page. They can't be sent as part of the body. So cookies in PHP, actually it's not just PHP, cookies must be sent as part of the header. So before you send any what is called body information, basically an HTML page is divided into what's called a header, and then you should have an end header, but this is all done for you automatically by PHP, and then a body and an end body. So an HTML page is divided into a header and a body. The header contains information, meta information, CSS information, information on how to format, and the like. So you have to call setCookie before you do any other manipulations. And you access cookies through the $_cookie array. And it's generally a good idea to check whether it's been set, because if the user has disabled cookies, then setCookie will fail. The other thing to know is that setCookie takes one page thing to happen before it is available. So when the page is sent, it's sent in the header, it's not yet available to the client. It's only when the page is sent back that the cookie information becomes available. So there's a bit of a lag in that the first time the page is displayed, the cookie is not yet available to that page. Okay, and that's what this statement is saying. The PHP sets a cookie, it will not be available on the first rendering of the page. So it has to go to the browser, get put into the browser's cache before it's available. So typically, when you see set cookie, it's in the first PHP code island. And you see here, I'm doing it before I am actually, here's the first code island where I do the set cookie. Here's the second code island where I do the remainder, where I set up the header and the like. So already I have set the cookie before I've done anything else. So typically, not typically, you have to do set cookie before you do anything else. Okay, so that's cookies. Okay, the second thing you can do is hidden form elements. And we talked about hidden form elements last time. You can send it as input type equals hidden, and it will get sent back to you as part of the form data. Okay, if you use hidden form elements, then they have advantages. Okay, they have no server storage. That actually was an advantage also with, I'm going to go back for a moment, for no server storage. So one advantage of cookies and hidden form elements is that you're using the browser storage or the user storage rather than your own storage. So cookies have this advantage too. There's no server storage. So no server storage because you're using the client storage. Then they're also usable with multiple servers. Okay, they can be used by the client. So they're usable by the client. The client can get access to them. So in Code Assessor, I pass a lot of information via hidden form elements, such as the number of attempts you have remaining. And unlike cookies, the client can't reject them. So that's a big advantage. The client's unable to reject them. Yes?
So unlike cookies, it's only usable by client, not the.
No, it's both. I'm sorry, usable by client and because they'll be sent back to the server. A hidden form element will be sent back to the server. It'll show up in the $post or $get or $request. Okay. So the disadvantages, they have many of the same disadvantages as cookies. They can be hacked because they are available and so they can be changed. 2, they consume bandwidth. They are limited to one page. So unlike cookies, where you could open and close the web browser or you could go to another page and they're persistent, here they're only on that one page. If you want them on a different page, you'll have to send them also to that other page. So cookies, they're there permanently in the client storage, so any page can access it. Hidden form elements are more temporary. They're only there on that one page. Okay. So you usually use hidden form elements when you want stuff available to the client, but it's not important if the hacker hacks them. Okay? So for example, in Code Assessor, you might say, well, wait a minute, Brad. If I'm a hacker, I'm going to increase my number of attempts that are available from 5 to 10. Well, that's just for informational purposes on the client side. When you send the code to me on the Code Assessor side, I look up in a database how many attempts you have left. Okay, the only reason I ship the number of attempts to the client side in Code Assessor is so that Code Assessor isn't constantly querying the server to ask how many attempts you have left. It reduces bandwidth by my toting the number of attempts over to the client side. But I don't trust that. I don't send the information back. It's actually, in that case, meant just for the client to have and to manipulate. But I don't trust it. Okay, so I typically use hidden form elements just because I want the client to be able to do stuff with them and to save myself from always having to query the server for it. Okay, the final thing is session. Well, the final thing that we really care about is session management. PHP session management. So this is a server-side solution. Okay, let me first show you how it works, then we will talk about it. So you always start your page with session start. That's the function. And what that does is if there is no table called $_session, it will set one up. And it is a hash table with key value pairs. So you can think of it like a global hash table that's simply keeping track of variables and their values that you want saved. If this is the first time that your session has invoked session start, it will set up the $_session, and it will generate a so-called session ID, which will henceforth be used to uniquely identify your session. And these session IDs are insanely long and insanely difficult to hack or to duplicate. So the session ID is typically either shipped to the user via a cookie or is added to all links and all forms automatically for you by PHP. We won't really worry about how that's done. Just know that PHP can make this happen for you. So it generates the session ID, and any subsequent call to session start will check if the session ID is null, that it knows it has to start a new session table and generate a session ID. If the session ID is already available, then the session ID is associated with a $session dictionary, which it will make available to you. And you can access all of your, so you can store information in a $session and you can access it. Okay, we're not really going to worry about destroying it, but if you want, you can destroy it with setting it to null and then calling session destroy, but you wouldn't typically do that. So you call session start at the beginning of your script, and after that you have the $_session available, which has your information that you need. And as a quick example of that in action, here is a pizza page, and I enter some information on it. And then I send the form, and it echoes back, you ask for pizza toppings, pepperoni, favorite color orange, and it has a button, press to reconfirm. I press to reconfirm, and it again echoes that information. So what happens is, initially I have a .html page up. Okay? And if we go and look at that, I know I'm going to run over a couple minutes, just bear with me. So if you look at the HTML, you see that it's going, the action is giving the URL to call my pizza session.php. So when the form data is sent, pizza session.php gets invoked. And you can see initially it calls session start, then it sets the session information to the form data. In this case, I sent it using the get method. And after it does that, it sets up an HTML page with the body, and it goes through the get, and it echoes out everything. Okay, and then at the end, it has a very simple form. That form says that when it's hit, you will call pizza session1.php. When pizza1.php is called, it again calls session start. Now that information in the session variable is available, and I'm able to access my toppings. I'm able to access my favorite color. I'm able to access the number that I entered. So I'm no longer using the get array because that doesn't, it lost the information. That's not associated with the previous form anymore. Instead, I'm using the session variables that stored the form data. Okay? So that's how you save information, is through the session variable. That's how I suggest you do it for your homework assignment, is you save the information through the session variable. And then you are able to retrieve it in subsequent scripts by executing session start, and then you'll have access to it. So when you're writing a web program and you're doing it with PHP, the basic idea is that you start by serving a HTML page to the client. So start by serving a .html file to the client. And it could be a .php file as well if you're generating dynamic content, but typically the first file that goes to the client is a .html file. Then the .html file, so I'll say 1, then the .html file is going to send, or the .html page will send form data to the server and invoke a PHP script. Now, at this point, it kind of becomes a bit like a do loop. So while there is more interaction with the user, your PHP script is going to do the following. It's going to save or call session start. Then it's going to save form data to $_session. And then it will generate the next page, next HTML document to serve back to the user. And that can be a combination of static HTML, so it can be a combination of static HTML with PHP code islands that generate dynamic content. So in the example you just saw with the pizza, we first served the pizza example, we first served a pizza.html file to the client. Then pizza.html had a form that called a pizza session.php script. The pizza session.php script, it saved the form data into $session and then generated a confirmation page which involved HTML markup. And finally, well, then it served it back, so then this confirmation page was sent back to the client, which displayed it. And finally, the confirmation page had a button that, when clicked, invoked a second PHP script called something like pizza session 1.php, and that PHP script repeated the confirmation page, this time by examining the _session table. So you can use this pizza example when you're working on the homework 8 assignment, and because it involves essentially the same kind of serving of information to a client or forms to a client, followed by processing of that information on the back end. Now, let's go over some of the advantages and disadvantages of PHP session management. So let's start with the advantages of PHP session management. And there are several. So first of all, the data is more secure. And it's more secure because the user on the client side does not have access to it. So that's as distinct from hidden form elements and cookies, where the client could get access to that data through JavaScript. So the data is more secure. Second, it consumes less bandwidth because the data is already on the server. It doesn't have to be served back to the server from the client. The third advantage is that the size of the data is determined by the server. So the size of the data is determined by the server and not by the browser's size limitation. So often a browser will have a limitation on the total amount of storage your cookies could take up. Now, there's probably less of a restriction on how much data your hidden forms could take up, but if you're going to be transmitting a tremendous amount of hidden form data, that's a lot of data that's going to keep going back and forth between the server and the client on each page served to the client, and then each PHP script that's invoked by the client. Each time all the hidden form data will be sent back and forth, so that could certainly slow down the response. So it's good that you can have then as much data as you want on the server side. And finally, it's quite simple to use. All you have to remember is to call session start at the top of your PHP script, and then you can use the $_session. So unfortunately, there's some disadvantages as well. And the big disadvantage is it can't be used by multiple servers. And the reason it can't be used by multiple servers is that the $sessions variable is stored in local storage on one server. So the $session table is stored in the local storage for one server, so it's not accessible from other servers. Now, interestingly, the session ID is accessible by multiple servers because PHP sends that information to the client, and then the client sends that session ID back to the whatever server gets it. So that's important when we get to database management in a moment. The other disadvantage is that the data is not available to the client. So the data is not available to the client. And the disadvantage of that is the client's going to have to query the server to get this data. And if the client has to constantly query the server for the data, that could slow things down as well as chewing up bandwidth. All in all, however, the advantages of server-side storage outweigh, in general, the advantage of client-side data storage, especially when the data is needs to be secure and you don't want it being hacked. Now, if you need to have multiple servers accessing your data, you have to go to the final session management strategy, which is database session management. So the first thing we need to know is how it works, and it should be pretty clear. You store the session information in a database, and you can look it up using the session ID. As I just said, the session ID is actually accessible to all servers because it's served back to the server in the URL that the client provides, and PHP ensures that that happens. So you can always get at the session, you can always get the session ID. There is a function called session ID that will return the session ID for you in PHP. Now, the advantages of database session management are pretty much all of the advantages of PHP session management. The data is more secure, you consume less bandwidth because it's not being transferred back and forth all of the time between the client and the server. The size of the data is determined by the server and not by the browser. So I'm going to say, in general, same advantages, or I'm going to say advantages 1 through 3 of PHP session management. It's not as simple, so I'm not going to claim advantage 4, which is simple to use, but the fourth advantage is that it's usable by multiple servers, which you need in a big production shop like, say, Amazon or eBay. So the disadvantages is that, one, just like PHP session management, the data is not available to the client. So the client has to constantly query if they want it. And then the second disadvantage is it's more complicated to implement because the programmer needs to do most of the implementation work. So that pretty much sums up the 4 ways that we can do session management for web programming. We can do it on the client side using cookies or by using hidden form elements. We can do it on the server side by using PHP session management or by using database session management. And then again, the other ways that we have to modify our thinking when we're doing web programming is that our input is going to be coming from forms rather than from a file or standard in, and our output is going to be in the form of an HTML document that gets served back to the client rather than output that goes to standard out or to the to a file. So for our next lecture, we're going to move on and talk about how on the server side in PHP you can communicate with a database, because you often do need to communicate with a database either for session management or because you're keeping other information there that needs to be retrieved or stored. And we're also going to talk about XML, which is an alternative way to store data, say an alternative way to a relational database. So those 2 things will be talked about next time, which are how PHP can connect to a backend database, in particular MySQL, and how we can represent data using XML.